Here's Dr. James Muecke.
From operating theatres to the national stage in Canberra, the renowned eye surgeon has a new perspective on life as Australian of the Year for 2020.
The word got around that there was a troublemaker on that group, and the troublemaker was me. And I thought, how can someone who's advocating for patients with type 2 diabetes, that they can actually put their disease into remission and actually is actively doing that with their patients, how can that be seen as a troublemaker? It's quite extraordinary to me that should be the case.
Dr. James Muecke, as an ophthalmologist, how did you become so interested in the type 2 diabetes epidemic?
Great question, Dave. Yes, so I've been an ophthalmologist now for over 35 years, and for this entire duration, I've been dealing with the blinding consequences that diabetes inflicts on the eyes. And I've been quite disturbed to see the growth in the number of patients who I'm treating with eye disease related to their diabetes, but also people who are losing vision, even going blind due to their diabetes. And most of this would be due to type 2 diabetes, which makes up about 90% of cases, as you are aware. And so it's been quite a extraordinary journey for me. And I think probably the pivotal moment, I always thought of myself as the guy at the end of the line treating these end-stage complications of diabetes. The most feared complication is actually loss of vision. But in 2018, I met a man whose story had a really powerful impact on me. I was actually filming a documentary about the experience of blindness, what it means to be blind, because I wanted to know as an eye surgeon myself. I was always fascinated what it would be like to be blind. So I interviewed 10 people, and 4 of those were children who had been born blind, and they had fascinating stories. 4 were people at the end of their life who were slowly going blind due to primarily a condition called age-related macular degeneration, which is the leading cause of blindness in wealthier countries. But the 2 who had such powerful stories were in the prime of their life, and they lost vision due to their diabetes. One was a high-flying corporate executive with type 1 diabetes, actually, and she just simply had neglected her eyes and her regular eye checks because she was just too busy. And she, unfortunately, is blind. And the other one who had a really powerful story was a guy called Neil Hansel, who came from a poorer socioeconomic group, and he had type 2 diabetes. And he tells this harrowing story of going to bed one evening with normal sight and waking up the next morning blind in both eyes. And one of my colleagues worked really hard to try and retrieve his sight, but unfortunately it was too late, and he remains blind to this day. And the story was incredible. And I was doing this documentary with my son, who's a filmmaker, and I was in tears. Neil was in tears. My son was in tears. The sound engineer was in tears. It was just such a powerful story. And he talks about the last thing he sees before he went to bed with his wife's, the beautiful smile on his wife's face. And that was the last thing he remembers. And he actually helped me to create a TV commercial, which played nationally on Channel 7 in Australia, trying to encourage people with diabetes to have their eyes checked. And he's actually helped me to do a couple of TV commercials to this day. So he's been a very, very significant ambassador, I suppose, for the need to have regular eye checks. We have something like 2 million people in Australia with type 2 diabetes, and well over half are not having their regular, all-important sight-saving eye checks. That's why it's become such a blinding condition in this country. It's now the leading cause of blindness amongst working-age adults. It's also the fastest-growing cause of vision loss in First Nations people, our Aboriginal people. So it's a blinding problem, and that's why I've become so interested in it.
That's a crazy number, because what's the population of Australia now? About 23 million?
Maybe 25 million. So it's getting close
Right.
to 10%. And in some countries, it's over 10%. I think the US, I believe it's now 50% of people have type 2 diabetes or pre-diabetes. It's staggering, but we're slowly growing. The number of patients with type 2 in this country is slowly increasing. So we're going to see more and more people, as I've noticed, and it's quite staggering now. to try and stave off loss of vision and blindness, we need to inject into patients' eyes a special antibody, which basically tries to halt the blinding consequences of this disease. And in this country now, over 150,000 injections given every year for patients with type 2 diabetes, trying to prevent these blinding consequences. And it's particularly troublesome because you realize that both type 2 diabetes can be potentially reversed, and it's largely preventable. So it just should not be happening, and it's quite simply not sustainable. I mean, this is $250 million spent every year trying to stave off these blinding consequences, and that's just one of a whole raft of life-changing and life-threatening complications of this disease.
So recently you wrote some articles that got my attention regarding food, nutrition, that kind of thing. Could you talk a little bit about those and how they relate to some of the work that you've been doing?
Sure, I've been writing opinion pieces for the last 5 years or so about diabetes and the drivers of primarily type 2 diabetes I've been writing about. And more recently, I felt a need to write something about the role of red meat. And there's been a lot of articles about the fact that red meat causes type 2 diabetes. Well, that's absolutely not the case. In fact, we know from a very powerful systematic review in 2019 published in the Annals of Internal Medicine that actually there's no evidence to recommend to people to reduce their red meat consumption on health reasons alone. So there's as you're probably aware, there's a significant narrative at the moment that red meat is bad for the health, bad for the planet, and it's morally the wrong thing to do to kill animals. And so I felt it was important to, in a sense, set the record straight that there's two sides of this really critical story. But if we're just talking about health primarily at the moment, then there is absolutely no, as I mentioned, there's no information of significance, of strong evidence to suggest that we should be reducing our consumption of red meat. And let's take cancer, for example. The evidence that red meat causes cancer is very flimsy indeed. It's based on what we call epidemiological evidence, which is based on observational studies, which we know are a low level of evidence. But some of the what we call mechanistic or experimental data is based on, again, laughable evidence. There was the International Agency for Research into Cancer bases its recommendation to reduce our red meat consumption on the fact that on 6 animal studies, 3 were done on humans and 3 were done on rats. And in the rat studies, each of the groups of rats were fed powerful carcinogenic cancer-causing chemicals prior to them being fed red meat. So how can you possibly say that it was the red meat that caused the cancer? So I think that from a health point of view, we should not be discouraging the consumption of red meat. In fact, we risk adverse health outcomes if we discourage the consumption of red meat. We know that something like 60% of vegans and 40% of vegetarians are vitamin B12 deficient, and vitamin B12 is essential for our neurological development and neurological health. And in America, I believe something like 40% of American young females from 12 to 20 are iron deficient because of their lack of consumption of red meat and the important intake of iron that provides. And there are many other micronutrients and vitamins and minerals that red meat supplies that we risk adverse health outcomes, let alone reducing our protein consumption.
Yeah. And of course, I mean, I'm in total agreement with you about this, but um, when you write these articles, when you talk about this kind of stuff, how is it received? Because I feel like there's people that are warmly going to receive this message, and then there's the other side that are going to be like, "Oh, you're just a whack job."
Yeah, so I tried to base everything I wrote in that piece on strong evidence, so that hopefully there'll be a group of people, particularly the vegan movement, who will just not take it seriously or try and pull it apart, and there'll be obviously people in the other end of the spectrum, the carnivore movement, who will love it, and but there's a huge body of people in the middle that are probably sitting on the fence, and actually this hopefully recalibrates their thinking about this. That it's there's two sides, as I mentioned. There's two sides to this, and people need to be aware, and that's why I felt a compulsion to write this story.
So you were given Australian of the Year, I think, in 2020.
Yes,
Could you talk a little bit about that, please?
yes. So I received that award in 2020, and that was a recognition of the work that I've done with my not-for-profit called Sight for All over many, many years. So it wasn't about the work I've been doing in the diabetes space. In fact, to be nominated for Australian of the Year, you have to win the state award, so South Australian of the Year. So I was put up for that very, very, very kindly by someone, and going to that award ceremony, I wasn't expecting to win it. But in my mind, I had a speech prepared, and it was all about the blinding risk of diabetes in this country, and the fact that, as I mentioned before, that patients with diabetes need to have their eyes checked on a regular basis. So I got up and made my speech when I won. I wasn't, as I said, I wasn't expecting to win, but I gave my speech, and I was encouraging people to go and have their eyes checked if they have diabetes, or if there's someone in the family with diabetes, because it's such a horrendous outcome to lose vision completely unnecessarily, or completely, when it can be prevented. So then, going forward to 2020, I thought, well, okay, I can continue on this pathway. I can talk about the need to have the regular eye checks if you have diabetes, but perhaps what I should do is go a bit deeper. If I was to win the award as Australian of the Year, as a doctor, what's Australia's biggest health crisis at the moment? It was certainly type 2 diabetes. And so that's what I decided to do. And when I won the award, I got up and I said that, we have a serious crisis on our hands with type 2 diabetes, and it's driven primarily by sugar. And obviously not long after that, COVID hit, and everything went to pieces. But I was able to keep on my pathway to try and discourage the consumption of excess sugar. But there were a lot of other learnings that I gained along the way, the role of seed oils in this whole process, and ultra processed foods. So it became a bigger thing than just sugar. And you asked me before whether I had any bite back because of my article on red meat. Interestingly, it was eerily quiet. I thought that this would have instigated all sorts of opportunities to speak on radio and TV, and no, it was very quiet indeed. In fact, 2 days later, there were a couple of articles that came out. One was an article which was in many of the big papers in the country, claiming that red meat caused type 2 diabetes. And we've subsequently been able to pull that story apart, and the study which came out of Monash University, which was a very flawed study. And also there was an article that came out a couple of days later claiming that red meat's bad for the environment. So it's amazing. There wasn't any direct attacks on me as far as I could tell, but the way that the response was to put out pieces in the media which had alternative views. So, yeah.
So you're still working with patients as far as consulting with them, advising them about what they should do with managing their diabetes?
Yes, I am. I'm actually probably going to retire at the end of the year, so I'm getting towards the end of my career in ophthalmology. And actually, so back in 2020, or actually in 2020, as part of the year as Australian of the Year, I was actually invited to be on the expert advisory group for the National Diabetes Strategy. And I managed to get into that document for the first time ever, the opportunity to put type 2 diabetes into remission. So that was quite a turning point in the history of the management of type 2 diabetes in this country. Quite a turning point indeed. And once that was published in 2021, I then started having a chat to my patients. I always thought of myself as a guy at the end of the line treating the end-stage complications, not ever thinking it was my role to have conversations about lifestyle, particularly diet. So when remission came out in that document, I felt I was safe to be able to at least talk about it or touch base with my patients about the opportunity for remission. And I have several hundred patients who I'm actively treating with diabetes-related eye disease. Majority of those would be type 2 diabetes. And the first 100 and I only spoke to the patients who had vision-threatening or sight-threatening eye disease. I've got a greater pool of patients who I'm just screening with diabetes, who I'm screening for eye disease. But these are patients I'm actively treating. So I started saying to them, were you aware that your type 2 diabetes could be potentially put into remission, that we could reverse it? And only one of that first 100 patients that I mentioned it to was aware. So this is a conversation that wasn't being had between GPs and patients. So what I did then was I wrote back to the GP and I said to the GP, and I copied in the endocrinologist, if the patient had an endocrinologist, could we please explore this amazing opportunity to put our mutual patients' type 2 diabetes into remission using a low carb or a ketogenic diet? Most of those letters were ignored. A few of the GPs took it on board, mostly at the insistence of their patients because they'd heard me talking about it. And then I started to see the odd patient coming back. And so I actually recommended a nutritionist. So me, myself, I just really raised the opportunity with the patient, recommended they talk to their GP, because trying to reverse a patient's type 2 diabetes comes along with a need to de-prescribe or demedicate a patient. So that's certainly out of my expertise. And really the dietary discussions, certainly at the time, were not part of my expertise. So I recommended a nutritionist. He's a nutritionist that specializes in therapeutic carbohydrate reduction. And so I started seeing patients come back who'd seen the nutritionist, that GP was on board, and it was quite extraordinary. And I remember the first one, it was a guy called Bevan Bruce. He was a real estate identity in South Australia. And he'd been having 8 weekly injections in both eyes for many years. Actually, I think since 2015. To that stage, it was 6 years of 8 weekly injections. I've tried to get him out beyond 8 weekly injections, but to no avail. So he went to see the nutritionist, and he came back between pairs of injections. The first visit afterwards, he'd come off his insulin. Wow, that was amazing to me. And then he came back the second pair of injections, and he'd come off all his medicines, all his diabetes medicines. He said that he was thinking more clearly, he'd lost a bunch of weight, and he was also seeing more clearly. So I still remember this experience as being one of the most thrilling experiences of my, well, I'm now 40 years, but probably at the time more like 33, 34 years of practice in medicine. This was the most exciting thing that I'd experienced in my significant over 3 decades of medicine. Someone who had actually turned their diabetes around. And what was amazing over the next few years, so between 2021 and 2023, I was able to reduce the frequency of his injections and down to 6 monthly, and he's now off his injections altogether. So just him alone, and I've tried this with a number of my patients. A number of my patients have put their type 2 into remission. Some haven't put it into remission, but they've improved all their metabolic markers. And even people who just reduce their carbohydrate intake, I'm finding again and again that the what we call their macular edema. I probably should come back and talk a little bit about macular edema. So that's the most common cause of loss of vision due to diabetes. And it happens in type 1 and type 2. But if we're just really focusing our conversation today on type 2 diabetes, diabetes damages the blood vessels throughout the body. But we have this amazing opportunity in ophthalmology to be able to see into the eyes. We can see the damage that's being done, and we can also see potentially the damage being reversed. So what I noticed was, and we do a scan of the central vision area, we get leakage of the fluid from the bloodstream into the tissues of the retina at the central vision area, what we call the macula, and this causes a loss of vision, distortion of vision, sometimes even blindness. And so the scan of the edema or swelling of the central vision area, what I noticed, as soon as the patients drop their carbohydrate carbohydrate intake, we saw this reduction in the edema and the swelling of the central vision area. So what I'm finding almost universally, and I now have over 25 patients who are having regular injections, who just by reducing the carbohydrate intake, I've been able to decrease the frequency of the injections, and quite a number have also been able to stop injections altogether. I also had a number of patients who weren't receiving injections. They were kind of borderline, and I remember this one woman who was 46 at the time, and I thought, let's rather than go down the injection pathway, let's send her down the dietary pathway. So I sent her off to the nutritionist, and within 2 weeks she came off her insulin, and over the next 9 months, her macular edema slowly dissolved away, essentially, and completely disappeared. So just with a change in diet alone, there was no other changes. Of course, there was a demedication of the patient, but there was no other changes to her what she was doing. It was simply this change in diet had resulted in this reversal in macular edema. Again, an extremely exciting experience for me as an ophthalmologist to see this happen. And I now have 15 patients who have reversed their macular edema just with changes in diet alone. And we're just about to publish that series. The case report of the woman, the 46-year-old woman, has now been published. It's the first time ever, but we now are just in the process of publishing 15, and we're looking at doing a bunch of trials around this to document through what we call randomized control trials, a higher level of evidence to show that this actually works. But what I'm finding almost universally, as soon as patients embark on this process, we see a reduction in their swelling and their blinding risks. So it's a super exciting thing to be involved in.
That's amazing. And, this is it's so sad that for years people just have been told or assumed that, okay, well, I've got type 2 diabetes, I'm stuck with it. And, the doctor is like, well, you've got type 2 diabetes, you just need to manage it now. And it's like they don't complete the sentence. And the rest of the sentence is because you're never going to be able to give up the cornflakes and the toast. You know, it's just like cut all the junk out, and your body can start to heal.
Absolutely, and that's a wonderful thing as an ophthalmologist, as an eye specialist, to see that improvement through this window we have into the body, and actually the damage is happening at every level, in every organ, every tissue of the body. So we're just having this opportunity to see it in ophthalmology. So yeah, absolutely, it's a great, it's a wonderful privilege to actually have this opportunity to be a part of this process.
Yeah, I can't help but feel there's some parallel here between what happened with Gary Fettke and what's happened with you, as far as, realizing there's something we can do about this. And, I'm sure, listening to your story, there's some dietitian out there going, I don't like this, that he's helping people. This is not.
Yeah, it's incredible. Actually, I just heard Gary and Belinda Fettke were staying with me for a couple of days. They left yesterday, and I heard when I was on the National Diabetes Strategy, the word got around that there was a troublemaker on that group, and the troublemaker was me. I mean, and I thought, how can someone who's advocating for patients with type 2 diabetes, that they can actually put their disease into remission and actually is actively doing that with their patients, how can that be seen as a troublemaker? It's quite extraordinary to me that should be the case. But we have remission in that document for the first time, so we know it's possible. And what happened then in 2022, actually, I was writing from 2021 through to 2022. I was writing to, as I mentioned, to GPs and copying in endocrinologists, and I was getting some pretty nasty letters back from endocrinologists, local endocrinologists. I had one patient who was disowned by his endocrinologist, said, if you do this, you can go and see someone else. But I was also getting some nasty letters, which I was able to argue back and actually point out where they were going wrong in their advice to me. But I thought, okay, well, their main concern was one of safety. The other main concern was one of the opportunity to put diabetes into remission, whether it had a sustainability about it. And so I thought, okay, if we're getting this resistance, let's get together the endocrinologists in Adelaide with the low carb practitioners, and there's a small group of low carb practitioners in this state. So it's for a roundtable discussion. Let's have it out and try and find some common ground here. So that was back in about 2 years ago in I think July or August in 2022, and Gary Fettke came over for it, and it was quite an unpleasant affair. It was quite adversarial. There was endocrinologists who were standing up and saying, "Oh, we did this back in the 70s, and all the patients who tried to reduce their carb intake died." And so at the end, I said, "Okay, clearly it can happen. Okay, you have some safety concerns, so let's get together and write guidelines." And so we had a low carb practitioner, Dr. Laura Smith, who's a GP in Adelaide, got together with Dr. Steve Strengths, who's an endocrinologist, and over 2023, they wrote guidelines for therapeutic carbohydrate reduction, which were completed early this year and subsequently endorsed by Australian Diabetes Society and Diabetes Australia. So it's super exciting. So this has now become mainstream. It's gone from this troublemaker to now being mainstream advice. We just have to get that advice out there. And once we had these guidelines endorsed by Diabetes Australia, and you mentioned this issue about type 2 diabetes being a progressive disease back in 2021, the very first line of the type 2 diabetes webpage for Diabetes Australia was type 2 diabetes is a progressive disease. And they've now changed that, which is fantastic. And Diabetes Australia has now taken on board Peter Bruckner's Defeat Diabetes program, which is basically all about low carb approach to improving metabolic health and reversing type 2 diabetes. So in earlier this year, I then subsequently met with the team at Dietitians Australia, and they are very interested. And as of the 1st of September, we've launched a 10-module metabolic health course for dietitians. So that's running at the moment. We're now looking at, and that's with a group called the Australasian Metabolic Health Society. So AMS is hosting that and running that. And we're now looking at, because we need to bring GPs up to speed as well. And GPs are out there in the community. We need to bring GPs up to speed and how to do this. And so we're in discussions now with the Royal College of GPs to create this opportunity for GPs to include this in their continuing professional development, their CPD. And so this Australasian Metabolic Health Society and Defeat Diabetes Australia will also launch that early next year. And the other thing we've been doing is we need to get this out into medical school. So all of the young budding doctors that are coming through the system need to be aware of this. And so I've written to all the medical schools around the country, and we've had meetings with about a quarter of the medical schools at this stage, saying we need to inject metabolic health into the medical school curricula. My son has just finished up in 6-year medicine, but back in 2nd-year medicine 4 years ago, he had the opportunity to do nutrition as an elective. So it's not even compulsory training in most of the major medical schools, as far as I'm aware, in this country. And yet our poor diet is responsible for more disease and death than smoking, alcohol, and physical inactivity combined.
So this all sounds like things are going in the right direction, at least in Australia. It almost feels like, bizarro world where everything's reversed from the regular way it should be. Like, what is it it feels like ordinarily there would be more pushback? Is it just that the pushback's been there, but you've just slowly been able to chip away at it?
Yeah, I've been slowly whittling away at it. I think that's actually absolutely the point. And I met with the Premier of South Australia, the head of the South Australian government, earlier this year, and he said that the thing that keeps him up at night is this health crisis that we have, and the ramping, what we call ramping of ambulances that can't get their patients into the hospital. And so the government is now starting to take it seriously. I've had a number of meetings at the federal level, but also at the state level, because I think in South Australia, along with the Northern Territory, we have the highest prevalence of type 2 diabetes. So, there's a real need to do something about this here in this state. So I thought we could act as a model for the rest of the country if we can get it right here. And as a result of a number of meetings with the Health Minister of South Australia, they've now set up a preventative health SA, a body to really look at and take seriously prevention. And I have a number of strategies which I've shared with the government, and they're now incorporating into a suite of preventative strategies which will be launched next year. So it's exciting times, and quite simply, we need to get this right. We need to. This is getting out of control. This health crisis. We have an obesity epidemic in children, in infants even. We have a type 2 diabetes epidemic. We're seeing type 2 diabetes, a disease when I was in medical school that was called maturity onset diabetes. We're seeing it in kids as young as 3 years of age in this country. And the core metabolic dysfunction is a condition called insulin resistance, and it also drives the major killers in our society. Heart attack. 80% of people who have heart attacks these days are insulin resistant. Stroke, dementia, many cancers as well. So this metabolic dysfunction is driving all this disease and death. And if you look at Australia-wide, it's been estimated roughly $20 billion are spent on type 2 diabetes. But if you realise that type 2 diabetes is a driver of many of these other diseases, I suspect the cost to our health system and to our society, to the taxpayer, is actually many-fold higher than that. So it's not just the drain on the economic drain, but also the devastation. And I think I mentioned earlier a guy called Neil Hansel who woke up blind that morning, with blind in both eyes. He's had 9 amputations of his left leg. He's had 2 heart attacks, a stroke. I mean, it's absolutely devastating, the impact of this disease on patients. And when you can actually quite simply, well, not quite simply, but when you can actually potentially turn it around, and we know that roughly 50% of people who attempt remission can put their type 2 diabetes into remission. And if we look at, let's say 2 million people in this country that we know have type 2 diabetes, there's about another 3 million more who have pre-diabetes. If you can actually turn around even half that number of patients, the cost to the health system, to the taxpayer, will be vastly reduced. And of course, the burden of the disease on the individual, on the family, will also be reversed. So it's something we should be aspiring to, and something we should be giving hope to our patients, not telling them they've got a progressive disease that will ultimately require medication, and ultimately they'll succumb to a whole raft of really nasty complications and an early death.
Yeah, it's really positive to hear how things are going there. It's it's a breath of fresh air, to be honest.
It is. Well, if South Australia can be a model for the rest of the country, and then Australia can be the model for the rest of the world. This is a global phenomenon. This is not just happening in Australia. And there are, as I mentioned, I've come up with this strategy which involves 3 elements: awareness, accountability, and assistance. And I actually gave evidence to the parliamentary inquiry into diabetes. That, again, shows you how seriously we're taking it here. There was a parliamentary inquiry late last year, and the reports come out recently. But there needs to be an awareness. This is the current awareness is that saturated fat's bad for you, that red meat's bad for you. You ask anyone in the street, that will be their response. But actually, the reverse is the case, that saturated fat is critical for health, and red meat is as well as critical for health. So we need to change that awareness around. We need to have awareness of the preventability of type 2 diabetes. If it's in the family, it doesn't mean that you have this life sentence. We need awareness around the potential reversibility of type 2 diabetes, the complications of type 2 diabetes. There needs to be a broad awareness campaign to change. We do need a paradigm shift, but we need this massive change in the direction that we're heading. And there's lots of layers of accountability. Of course, the predatory marketing that goes on by the ultra-processed food industry, the sugary drinks industry, the fast food industry, who are preying on people's addictions with their addictive food, which is often loaded with sugar. So we need accountability, and the government allows this predatory marketing to go on everywhere in our environment. You can't walk into most petrol stations without being confronted by a wall of confectionery. You can't check out from most supermarkets and stores, even chemists these days, without being enticed by half-price chocolates and sugary drinks. It's absolutely diabolical. Bus stops, buses, trams, you name it, everywhere in the environment you go, you're being predated upon by these industries. So this needs to stop, because I have no doubt we know that type 2 diabetes is strongly associated with food addiction. And if you say that roughly 50% of people will be able to put their diabetes into remission, that leaves another 50% who really struggle with it for a number of reasons. But one of those reasons, quite simply, would be addiction to food, to ultra-processed food, to sugary drinks, etc. So if you can actually deal with that, then we'll also have a much bigger impact on potential remission for type 2 diabetes. So accountability needs to be there. Our current dietary guidelines recommends limited meat. It recommends reducing saturated fat, replacing that saturated fat with seed oils. So the current dietary guidelines are, the literature review started back in 2009, so it's really 15 years out of date. It's also been biased in its making. It's flawed, and it's giving people the wrong message. And yet it's being used very broadly. It's being used by teachers to teach kids at school. It's being used by cooks in hospitals, in prisons, in the Defence Force, etc. It's used in aged care through childcare through to aged care. It's also being used by our army of health educators and health providers and government health policy makers. So it's being used very broadly. So the current dietary guidelines is currently under review, but it won't come out to 2026. So we've still got a couple of years, and hopefully we'll see a change. I don't think we'll see the 180-degree shift that we need. So there needs to be accountability, and we need to ask the question, well, how was this document so biased in its making? How was that allowed to happen? We have to ask the question, is it working? Well, clearly the advice is not working, because 2/3 of Australians are overweight or obese, and a quarter of our kids are overweight or obese. And also, we've got to ask the question, could this document be causing harm? Well, yes, it can, because bodies such as the Royal College of GPs are advising people with type 2 diabetes eat according to the Australian Dietary Guidelines. Diabetes Australia still echoes this advice in their pre-diabetes and their type 2 diabetes web pages. And yet people with type 2 diabetes are carbohydrate intolerant by default of being insulin resistant. They're carbohydrate intolerant. So you're having bodies, and there are lots of other health associations as well, recommending the Australian Dietary Guidelines be used for people who are carbohydrate intolerant. So it makes absolutely no sense to me. So there needs to be an accountability. There also needs to be layers of assistance as well. So we need to get this message, this critical message, out to GPs that type 2 diabetes can be put into remission. You can actually do this. So how do you demedicate a patient? So we have guidelines that are written now. So we need to get it out there. So there needs to be this layer of assistance. There also needs to be a layer of assistance for patients as well with metabolic dysfunction, being able to determine their metabolic dysfunction at a much earlier stage. By the time the blood sugar starts to rise, it's often well advanced. So we should be looking at point of care blood insulin testing, so that we can see the metabolic dysfunction quite early in the piece. We need access now to patients with type 2 diabetes for continuous glucose monitoring, so they can see the impact of certain foods, often foods which are touted as being healthy, to see the impact of those particular foods on their blood sugars. And also patients in lower socioeconomic areas, particularly patients with type 2 diabetes. We know that patients with type 2 diabetes are more prevalent in lower socioeconomic areas. So they can have access to real food, to whole food, maybe subsidised for those patients in those particular areas, so that they can actually access healthy foods rather than ultra-processed foods, which now make up, I think, close to 50% of the calories in the diet in Australia. And there needs to be other layers of assistance. I mean, it's quite a difficult hurdle for patients to afford access to nutritionists and dietitians that are competent at prescribing therapeutic carbohydrate reduction. So they often go it alone, and that can sometimes put them in potential danger, particularly if they're on certain medications. If they drop their carb intake, they might also drop their blood sugar. And if they're on insulin, for example, that might put them at risk. So they need to do this in conjunction with their GP. And the GPs often don't have time to have those really important discussions. So we need to engage dietitians and nutritionists in this process, but we also need to have subsidised visits to these healthcare professionals so that they can access this really critical advice.
If you've got a patient in front of you that's looking like they're going to have vision problems because of the type 2 diabetes they've got, what would be the way that you would introduce the idea of therapeutic carbohydrate restriction to them without them feeling like, oh, hang on, this is going to be too much. I can't do without the donuts or the whatever.
Yeah. And some patients, as much as I've tried, and because they come back for regular injections, I'm able to have this conversation with them and then follow up and continue the conversation. And so it's, again, I have that privilege of being able to do that. And some patients quite simply will not engage in the process. And despite my pestering them, despite the fact that they've having dialysis, renal dialysis several times a week, they're having injections in their eyes on a 4 to 6 weekly basis, they're having amputations of their limbs, so they just don't engage in it. And I find it devastating to not be able to succeed with those patients. And other patients, I'll say, oh, can we have a chat to you about your diet? Oh, doc, my diet's fine. I'm eating lots of grains and cereals. I'm not eating much meat. And I say to them, well, actually, this is the complete opposite to what you should be doing. You have this intolerance to carbohydrate, and having lots of carbohydrates is actually doing your body harm. But generally what I do is I touch on the opportunity for remission. I say to patients, firstly, are you aware that diabetes could be put into remission? And as I said before, most of them have no idea. A few more because of what's happening in the public arena. There's more discussion about this and more awareness about this, which is good. So people are starting to get this message, and so it's they're virtually all interested. If you can tell the patient that your diabetes could be put into remission, almost all of them are interested in the opportunity. Not all of them go forward with it, but certainly all of them at the outset could you imagine patients with cancer, if finding out their cancer could be put into remission? It gives such hope and such power and empowerment to the patient. So again, if you have this opportunity to put your type 2 diabetes into remission, a disease which has this horrendous prospect for the patient, it's quite extraordinary. And so, and so I say to them, well, okay, we need to reduce your carb intake because you are intolerant of carbohydrates. And this primarily means reducing your sugar, which is a carbohydrate, so sugary drinks. It involves also reducing your consumption of what we call refined carbohydrates, so products such as highly refined white flour and white rice and peeled white potatoes. They're simply pure starch, virtually pure starch. And all starches are long chains of glucose, which break down into single glucose molecules as soon as they enter the body. So, you're intolerant of these. So we should be looking at non-starchy vegetables for you. We should be reducing your consumption of high sugar fruits, going for low sugar fruits. And the other thing which is really important is seed oils, which we know also drive insulin resistance. So the two key drivers are fructose, the fructose component of sugar, and seed oils. They both independently give rise to insulin resistance, which, as I mentioned, is the core metabolic dysfunction driving type 2 diabetes. And they're the major components of most ultra-processed foods. So the major components of most ultra-processed, what I prefer to call ultra-processed food-like substances, are sugar, refined carbs, often in the form of flour, and seed oils. So they're like a loaded gun causing metabolic mayhem in the liver. So these are the things I discourage the patient from consuming. But then, so once I've got them on board, I recommend the nutritionist. I organise a referral to the nutritionist, along with a letter to the GP to explain what I'm doing, and let it unfold from there. It's been a revelation to me as a medical practitioner of 40 years to see patients turn what we formerly thought was a progressive chronic disease into a disease that can be turned around.
Yeah. So how is your diet as far as your level of carbohydrate intake?
Yeah, so I'm back in 2020 when I won the award, and I thought, well, if I'm going to be telling people to reduce their sugar consumption, I've got to walk the talk. So I went into I reduced my sugar consumption greatly. I also took on some intermittent fasting. I time restricted eating, simply going from having 3 meals a day to cutting out my breakfast. And my breakfast, if you realise what I had for breakfast before, was abominable. And I went into the first lockdown back in 2020 and came out of the lockdown. I'd lost, I don't know, 10, 15 kilograms. And people were coming up to me saying, my God, you're okay. You got cancer. You look, you've lost so much weight. No, I think this is probably the way I should look. And since that time, I would say I hover between low to medium carb. So I'm not in a ketogenic state, and I certainly see the benefits of being in a ketogenic state. But metabolically, all my blood markers are absolutely pristine, so I'm comfortable with the place I'm in with my metabolic health. So continue on. I certainly, as much as possible, I avoid seed oils. As much as possible, I avoid ultra processed foods. I've certainly minimised my sugar intake. I'll have some dark chocolate, usually sort of 85, 90% chocolate these days, which is very low in sugar. Occasionally I'll have potatoes, I'll have rice, I'll have generally whole grain bread, but for the most part, that would be a minimum. And I think my diet is certainly much healthier than I used to be, and it certainly shows in terms of my physical health, my metabolic health, my mental health.
So you don't have a sanitarium loyalty card?
No, not at all. No, no. In fact, I had for years, like many of us, I had Weet-Bix was the staple for breakfast, and Weet-Bix, usually 5 Weet-Bix in a bowl piled high with sugar. So sanitarium is off the cards in every. And actually, as the kids were growing up, they often went off to school with an Up and Go in their lunchbox, and I realised that Up and Go is an ultra processed product with over 20 ingredients, including sugar, refined carbs, and seed oils, what I mentioned before. So I didn't realise that I was potentially doing my kids harm, and you feel terribly guilty. But I suppose it's better late than never, and the kids all realise now that we're best to avoid these products as well.
Yeah. So how can people reach out to you, James? Do you have a website or any way of getting in contact?
Yeah, probably the best way is just through my various social media accounts: Facebook, Instagram, and LinkedIn. I'm not on Twitter or X. I have a website, but I'm about to change it, so wouldn't bother that. So those would be the main ways of getting in touch with me if they want to.
No worries. I'll link to all of those below. Dr. James Muecke, I really appreciate you coming on and sharing your experience with us. And it's actually much better news about the way things are progressing in Australia than I'd expected. So it's great to hear.
It is good, and I think I'm an eternally positive person, and I'm actually at the moment meeting with a whole bunch of politicians. I'm actually presenting to Parliament in late November this year, because I think what we need is what we call a bipartisan approach. We need both major parties on board with this, because there's no point in the current state government taking on this preventative health measure and the opposition party trying to pull it down. We need both sides of government on board. So we're definitely progressing. So it is exciting, and we just need all of these other layers to fall in place, and particularly we need this accountability when it comes to our dietary guidelines and the predatory marketing that goes on, and the might of the food industry, which is astonishing.